This is a particular psalm that's from the collection of the choir master. It is written for flutes. Remember the earlier one we said was written for strings? And understand that they have three kinds of instruments. They have string instruments, they have wind instruments, and they have drums, percussion. So those are the three kinds of instruments they use. Again, it reminds us of a psalm, and then it says it comes from David. So, 1. Yahweh, let my words come to your ears. Spare a thought for my sighs. One of the things that we have come to a better understanding of than the Jews have is we have this concept of the universality and the power and the dimension of God. The Jews sort of saw God, I think you've heard the joke that the people constantly use, that God made us in His image and we've spent all of history trying to return the favor. That there's always the effort to make God more like us. And it's a very important thing for religious leaders to constantly remember we are made in His image. He is not like us. We are made in His image. And there's specific things in the Psalms where He says, I'm not like you. I don't think the way you think. You've been made in my image, but I'm not in yours. And so, anyway, their idea, it was very difficult for them to understand God listening to everyone. And I've oftentimes used this example with you, but I think it's something to be very, very cautious of. Like for instance, if I have a fight with another person, I cannot claim God on my side. Period. Even if I'm in the right, God will not side with me against anyone. For any reason. God never sides against someone. So when you're praying, you always have to somehow, think about the fact that the other person is praying for as well. So for instance, if you want to get a promotion in a job, and you're looking for it and everything, you have to understand there's other people praying for that promotion too. And maybe no one else on the face of the earth ever thinks that way, but isn't it wonderful for you and I to be able to come into God's presence respecting other people's prayers as well? Everyone's praying. I know everyone's praying, And I don't know about you personally, but I oftentimes have the feeling, that when I, pray for what may be really significant to me, like when's breakfast, the intense problems that I have to deal with. So I may be, and to imagine there are people starving to death wondering if there will be another meal, not what time breakfast is. And to imagine, all these prayers come into the presence of God. But on the other hand, our God hears all of them with equality. God is as much concerned about me and breakfast as He is about the person who is quite literally starving. And this whole idea of our God's unbelievable ability to hear every prayer as though it is the only word in all of history. He has this amazing ability. And so we ask God to spare a thought for my sighs. Listen to my cry for help, my King and my God. I'd also like you to notice we oftentimes use this King and God, and understand that King and God are two very different things. When we talk about God as God, what we're talking about is a relationship of worship and a relationship of prayer and this sort of thing. When I speak of God as my King, do you realize I'm reversing it? It is the purpose of the King to take care of the people. And so when I acknowledge Him as my God, it's my duty to worship. When I acknowledge Him as my King, it's His duty to take care of me. And that's what basically a leader does. I think it's one of the great tragedies of history is that we oftentimes encounter politicians, pastors, parents who are more interested in themselves than the people in their care. But the fact of the matter is, like for instance, if I were a parent and had children, when I come before God, my responsibility is to the children, okay? I think you know that thing on the airlines they do constantly that if there's an emergency, put your mask on first rather than the child's. Do you know why they have you do that? It's for the benefit of the child, not you. The child's finished if you die. But if you have your mask on, you can help and deal with the child. But the idea is for the benefit. We are always for the benefit of the people that God puts in our care. And we tend to think, like for instance, if you're a king, you tend to think of the robes and the crown rather than the people. If you're a pastor, you tend to think of the robes, the setting and everything, rather than the people. And there's a great danger to that all the time. God never does that. God always thinks of me first. He's always, in reference to me, my king. Okay? He's always my king. It says, I say this prayer to you, Yahweh, for at daybreak you listen for my voice, and at dawn I hold myself in readiness for you. I watch for you. The idea is that dawn marks the beginning of a new day, and the beginning of the new day is a day in which Yahweh is watching for me. And it's a day in which I'm listening for God. One of the interesting things is when you study the whole concept of prayer, probably the most difficult aspect of prayer for most people is they have the feeling they're talking to a blank wall. That they say things and God never responds. And one of the key things to understand theologically that God is speaking to you through everything you see. He's speaking to you through everything you hear from every single person, from the bark of a dog to the person who compliments you, to the person who corrects you. God's words are woven into everything you hear, into everything you see, into everything you sense, into everything you imagine. 24 hours a day, God is trying to talk to me. We are very lucky as human beings if we learn to hear Him one word a day. Most people never do that, okay? I probably have told you that one of the studies I did when I was going through art was the study of the psychology of dreams. And I'll tell you something about dreams. Every person has 7 dreams a night. There's 7 dreams. And most people can only remember a few little snaps of the last dream. Now you can train yourself to remember up to 3. You have to be very good to get beyond 3. But there's very simple exercises that will cause you to remember the full last dream, usually the one before it thing. Most people only remember a dream because an alarm clock wakes them in the middle of it. Okay? That's usually the only time they sort of catch it. But the fact of the matter is you have the dreams. Well, the same thing's true. God is speaking to me 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And just because I don't understand it or don't get it doesn't mean He isn't talking. Any more than you hear people say all the time, I never dream. I think, isn't that cute? Okay? Everybody has 7 dreams a night. You've had millions of dreams, Just never contact them. So this idea of being able to do it, I'll tell you one trick. One trick is to take just a few minutes in the morning when you get up and say specifically to yourself aloud, even if it disturbs your spouse, say specifically to yourself aloud, today God is going to speak to me. That somehow alerts you. Okay? Today, sometime He's going to speak to me. And then at night, before you go to bed, try and find it. You find over a period of time, you actually get really good at it. You'll get really good at it. And eventually, you'll reach a point where you'll hear it when it's happening. Okay? But it's a very simple exercise. And can you imagine, just imagine who God is. Just for a moment, imagine who God is. And He's trying to speak to every single person on the face of the earth. Do you know that most of the people on the face of the earth would give their lives to hear a single word from God? A single word to know He's there. It's a very simple way to do it. A very simple way to do it. Going on. It says, you are not a God who is pleased with wickedness. You have no room for the wicked. Boasters collapse under your scrutiny. We're talking about 2 things here. The first thing we're talking about is the idea that God is never pleased with wickedness. And when we think of wickedness, we think of sinfulness. But one of the things that goes on, remember I told you this is wisdom literature? There's a difference between being wise and being somehow insidiously clever. And this is kind of what they're looking at. This wickedness is sort of a cleverness as distinct from wisdom. A wisdom is really a practical service in the presence of God, whereas wickedness is a practical service in the presence of myself. Okay? It's not that it's necessarily against God. I don't care if it helps God or not. I'm just interested in it helping me. Okay? And that's the nature of wickedness. Remember I talked about those two paths? That's the nature of wickedness. And God is never pleased with that. And God has no room for that. Why? Because wicked people really aren't alert to God. It isn't as though God doesn't want to speak to them, but wicked people are actually alert to other things. And so they simply don't catch God. It's one of the more interesting things that happened to me. I think I've told you a lot of times, because I have dyslexia, God very seldom speaks to me through words. He speaks to me visually. But because I've studied art, one of the things you study about art is perspective. And if you were to take a painting with a background and everything, you look at it as a beautiful painting. But you have to know that if you were in that scene, let's say we have a sailboat on a beach with a sunlight playing on the, the water, and a lighthouse in the distance. Do you know that if you were looking at the lighthouse, you would not see the sailboat? If you're looking at the sailboat, you wouldn't see the lighthouse. The reason is your eyes focus on different things. Now when you put a painting, one of the things you have to do with a painting is you have to focus on the foreground. You get that done. Then you focus next thing, and you focus the next thing, and you put all these together in order to make a painting. And that's one of the things you learn. Well, one time when I was in Costa Rica, there's a bird down in Costa Rica that is universally held as the most beautiful bird in the world, and it's called a quetzal. The quetzal is a big bird. It's strikingly scarlet and it's just a gorgeous bird. Rotten voice. But anyway, it's a gorgeous bird. And why not? It lives on avocado. You know, it's great. But anyway, the woman was taking us on a tour through the rainforest, and she saw a bird. She was telling us it wasn't the season for quetzal, which it wasn't, and she was disappointed we weren't going to see one. And so she was showing us this bird on this tree and explaining it and everything. And then I said to her, "Is that a quetzal behind it?" And she said, "Behind it." And she looked, and 3 trees back there was a quetzal in the tree. And then she looked at me, she says, "How could you see that?" I said, "When you study art, you learn to focus and then refocus and then refocus. You learn to look at different distances." And you see, I think a lot of people go through life, when they listen, they don't focus. There's a meaning. Like if you speak to me, there's what you've said, what you want to say to me, what you are really saying out of you. There are 3 levels to everything everyone says. When you look at things, there are different levels to the whole thing. And understand that if you can't see God in this thing, look a little further. Go beyond. Maybe you focus on God at a different point in the thing. Okay? But this idea of being able to see, to somehow, go off to all these different things. And it says, boasters collapse under your scrutiny. I'll tell you a secret. Boasters collapse under anyone's scrutiny. Okay? People who boast of what isn't there. And if you look, you discover it isn't there. You know the terrible thing of boasting? It's the terrible thing of pride. If you listen to a person who really boasts about things, it is a person who does not understand their value. If they do not understand how valuable they are, they'll try and make themselves look more valuable. Okay? And when they make themselves look more valuable, they actually look ridiculous. They flat out look ridiculous. And so that's something to understand, that if I feel a need to boast, and a lot of people do, and incidentally, if you feel a need to boast, understand that's no vice, it's a symptom. If you feel a need to boast, there is really something about you where you don't quite understand your particular value in the presence of God. You know, that if you've ever dealt with children in art, I've taught art in school, but if you ever deal with children in art, for some reason, children in art fix on drawing. Okay? So if the little kid sits down and can't really draw well, and drawing is a technique. There's no talent to drawing. Do you know where the talent in art is? The talent is to be able to see. Drawing you learn. Nobody's good at it when they start. But you know, I can look at a little tiny kid who puts together a picture, and you know, he said, well, I couldn't keep within the lines. He gets all finished, and I tell him, you have no idea the sense of color you're exhibiting. You know, it's an unbelievable sense of color. And the fact of the matter is, every one of us is in fact a treasure. And if we don't realize it, we should begin to search for it. But if I'm boasting, you can know I do not realize the treasure I am. I just don't realize it. Okay? So if you ever encounter people boasting or people of unbelievable pride, you should really feel sorry for them. Don't feel angry or anything. Feel sorry. It is someone who does not know their value. Okay? If they knew their value, they wouldn't be boasting at all. You wouldn't have to. It says, you hate all evil people, and liars you destroy. Murderers and frauds you detest. And notice what they're doing here is basically going through a list of vices, where we have the wickedness, we have the boasters, we have the evil, we have the liars, we have murderers, and we have frauds. It's basically, our God is against anything that takes a toll on other people. Pure and simple. Okay? So all these things take a toll on other people. And so our God is against all of that. And then he says, but I, so great is your love, may come into your house. I'd like you to notice this. So great is your love. You and I are not admitted to God's house because we are holy. I'm admitted to God's house because He is holy. I'm not admitted to God's house because I'm innocent. I'm admitted to God's house because He's innocent. I'm not admitted to God's house because I deserve to be there. I'm admitted to God's house because He deserves to be there. To understand this admission to God's house has to do with who God is. And He invites us to be a part of His house. And, you know, it's the idea, I've used this example with you before. I think it's one of the cuter things that when you take a child to the SPCA to pick out a dog, they will always pick out the most miserable, sickliest dog sitting off in the corner. Okay? If you want to get a decent dog, have them pick it out yourself. Have them pick it out themselves. But if you go, and you go with your children, or someone your family picks out, you'll always pick that. And do you know why you do that? It is instinctive for people made in the image of God to reach out to people who need them, to reach out to animals who need them, much more than to reach out to the healthy and strong. That's why when you're in the presence of God, never push your strength. It's not in your favor. Okay? When you get in the presence of God, let Him know how weak you are, how clumsy, how needy. It gets Him like you cannot imagine. Okay? You come into the presence of God like that, trust me, you're going home with Him. Okay? That's what He takes home. And that's part of being what it is to be the image of God. This need to care. This need to care. And because of that, we end up in God's house. Before your holy temple, bow down in reverence to you. So I'm allowed to come into your home, and I'm allowed to bow in reverence to you. Remember, for the Jews, no one even saw God. Okay? The high priest once a year went into the Holy of Holies and he didn't see God. People did not look upon God. In fact, the thing that was part of their tradition is that they believed anyone who actually saw God would die. Do you remember that with everything that went on in Moses' life? When Moses found himself in the presence of God, he thought he was toast. Okay? And that's just the nature in the Jewish thing. Well, you can say all that, but the fact of the matter is, our God has invited us into His presence one day to see Him face to face. It's because He loves us. Flat out, He loves us. Yahweh, lead me in the path of your righteousness, for there are people lying in wait for me. Make your way plain before me. We ask God to lead us in His path of righteousness. And this path is the path that God sets up for each of us in our own lives. And to understand that God will only lead us on that path. God will lead us on no other path. I must be on God's path of righteousness. But on God's path of righteousness, He will lead me. And there's an interesting passage, I think it's in Isaiah, where He talks about a road set up in the wilderness. He says, it is a road only for those with a purpose. No one stumbles on this road by accident. On this road there are no dangers. There's no lions to be met. It is absolute safety. And that is the path of righteousness. The path of righteousness is this path that God invites us on, and it is safe. But there's all kinds of things lying on the edge of this path. When I was in Africa, one of the things that I stayed at was a camp run by the Maasai in the center of the savannah. It's called Masai Mara, and it's a place from which you go out on safaris and everything. But the way they have the houses set up, the houses look like native huts on the outside. Inside they look like the Hyatt Regency. But outside they look like native huts, and they're set up down the thing from the main gathering area. The Masai Mara is set on a little peninsula. There's a river that comes down and sort of makes a peninsula there. There's an unbelievable wall on one side where the road comes in, but there's about a 3 foot wall that goes along the edge of the river. And you can see these elephants, giraffes, everything just across. And the river isn't 25 feet wide. And so I asked the guy, I said, why is it we have such a huge wall up on this other end and nothing to protect from this? He says, crocodiles. Nothing steps in the river. Okay? He was right. You could look at lions right across there drinking. They could practically leap to where you are, but they aren't stupid enough to try. Okay? So they sit there. But anyway, this idea that I went one evening to a dinner and stayed for some music and stuff, and when I went later that night, I left to go down to my little hut, and as I was leaving, the man said, where are you going? And I said, well, I'm going back to my room. He says, you can't go to your room without someone with you. And I said, okay. I'd done it 3 nights in a row. But anyway, so I said, okay, so we're going down. He reaches my hut, and he said, he said, do you know why you can't go to your hut without someone walking with you? And I said, no. Took his flashlight, went across the woods, you saw nothing but eyes. And he says, those are hyenas. And he says, the hyenas come up here. I said, I've gone down, 3 times and never seen them before. Now I, of course, won't leave the door without wetting my pants. But before, I was able to go down there. And the man said that because the trail is so well used, he says that oftentimes they won't come up, but it is dangerous. Okay, and that's something to realize, that the reason why this path is safe is because God is leading us on it, and no evil dares approach God. So as long as we're staying there, we're safe because of our closeness to God. And the next thing is, make your way plain before me. I'd like you to understand that is one of those prayers that God will always answer. Okay? That if you seriously and honestly pray to God to be faithful in following God, you will inevitably be faithful in following God. The difficulty is, He'll never come and tell you so. Okay? Like what we would really love is for God to come down from heaven and tell us, you're doing a great job. It would be so clear. But God doesn't do that. What God does is if you get off the trail, He'll come and talk to you. Okay? So as long as you're on the trail, really, really fine. And the best example of that in Scripture, incidentally, is St. Paul. St. Paul was a holy and good man who was really dedicated to the sacred teachings of Israel. And he was very upset when he saw a group of people who were turning away from the foundations of Israel to abuse it. So he set about to correct them, all out of goodness and holiness in relationship to God. And because he was sincere and made a mistake, God intervened. God says, Paul, no. This is what I want you to do. So if you are sincere and we make a mistake, He will intervene. He'll find a way to intervene. Okay? So if you do your best, pray to know God's will, follow it to the best of your knowledge, and know that you are following it, or He will find a way to intervene. That's the fact. Okay? A lot of people get all upset because they would really like a letter of reference or something. Okay? So, not a word from their lips can be trusted. Deep within them lies ruin. Their throats are yawning graves. They make their tongues so smooth. These are the liars that attempt to lead us away. It says, not a word can be trusted, because ruin lies in them and then in their words. And their throats, you follow their words, they are open graves. They make their tongues so smooth. And I'd like you to notice this, make your tongue so smooth. One of the things that Paul will tell the people at one time, he says near the end of his life, he says, I have not used high-sounding language with you. I have not used any heavily concocted arguments. He says, I have always spoken to you the blatant truth. Okay? He speaks the flat-out truth. And I have often believed that in the presence of God, it is more important to speak clearly than to speak cleverly. Now, cleverness in speaking is a gift some people have with great facility. And a person who has cleverness in speaking, could be a stand-up comedian, could be a teacher, could be a preacher of the gospel, could be 100 things, okay? But the key thing about the gospel is to be able to speak it truly and clearly. And if you speak it truly and clearly and are a rotten speaker, you will plant the seed. You don't need to be clever with the gospel. You just need to be right. If you're clever, it's good. It's cute. People will enjoy it. But that isn't what makes the gospel. I don't know if many of you know the life of Jean-Marie Vianney, but Jean-Marie Vianney is the classic example of that. After the French Revolution, the church was devastated in France. And so they had people training for the priesthood. This young man, very, very holy, very dedicated, and not very clever. Okay, so anyway, he went through his classes, and in the classes, I was educated in the European system. And in the European system, when you finish your classes at the end of 4 years, you get your exams. You have no exams while you're going through. At the end of the 4 years, you're examined on all the material. And so they're called the canonical exams. And so that's what they did with Jean-Marie Vianney. They went through all the tests, and so everyone was passed except Jean-Marie Vianney. And he did this 3 years. Now, it is unusual, as you can imagine, it is unusual in something like that to get higher than 70% in the test. Like you're covering 4 years of material. So it's unusual to get higher than 70%. After the several years of Jean Marie Vianney taking it and failing it and taking it and failing it, he took it again. The bishop goes through the tests. And when the bishop went through